contracting. Trade is shrinking. Unemployment is rising. The international finance system is nearly frozen. Even these facts can't fully capture the crisis that we're confronting, because behind them is the pain and uncertainty that so many people are facing. We see it back in the United States. We see it here in London. We see it around the world. Families losing their homes, workers losing their jobs and their savings, students who are deferring their dreams. So many have lost so much. Just to underscore this point, back in the United States, jobless claims released today were the highest in 26 years. We owe it to all of our citizens to act, and to act with a sense of urgency. In an age where our economies are linked more closely than ever before, the whole world has been touched by this devastating downturn. And today, the world's leaders have responded with an unprecedented set of comprehensive and coordinated actions. Now, just keep in mind some historical context. Faced with similar global challenges in the past, the world was slow to act, and people paid an enormous price. That was true in the Great Depression, when nations prolonged and worsened a crisis by turning inward, waiting for more than a decade to meet the challenge together. Even as recently as the 1980s, a slow global response deepened and widened a debt crisis in Latin America that pushed millions into poverty. Today, we've learned the lessons of history. I know that in the days leading up to the summit, some of you in the press, some commentators confused honest and open debate with irreconcilable differences. But after weeks of preparation and 2 days of careful negotiation, we have agreed on a series of unprecedented steps to restore growth and prevent a crisis like this from happening again. Let me outline what I think has been most significant. Number one, we are committed to growth and job creation. All G20 nations have acted to stimulate demand, which will total well over $2 trillion in global fiscal expansion. The United States is also partnering with the private sector to clean out the troubled assets, the legacy assets that are crippling some banks, and using the full force of the government to ensure that our action leads directly to loans to businesses, large and small, as well as individuals who depend on credit. And these efforts will be amplified by our G20 partners, who are pursuing similarly comprehensive programs. And we also agreed on bold action to support developing countries so that we aren't faced with declining markets that the global economy depends on. Together, the G20 is tripling the IMF's lending capacity and promoting lending by multilateral development banks to increase the purchasing power and expand markets in every country. We've also rejected the protectionism that could deepen this crisis. History tells us that turning inward can help turn a downturn into a depression. And this cooperation between the world's leading economies signals our support for open markets, as does our multilateral commitment to trade finance that will grow our exports and create new jobs. That's all on the growth front. Next, we made enormous strides in committing ourselves to comprehensive reform of a failed regulatory system. And together, I believe that we must put an end to the bubble and bust economy that has stood in the way of sustained growth and enabled abusive risk-taking that endangers our prosperity. At home, back in the States, our efforts began with an approach that Secretary Geithner proposed last week, the strongest regulatory reforms any nation has contemplated so far to prevent the massive failure of responsibility that we have already seen. Today, these principles have informed and enabled the coordinated action that we will take with our G20 partners. To prevent future crises, we agreed to increase transparency and capital protections for financial institutions. We're extending supervision to all systemically important institutions, markets, and products, including hedge funds. We'll identify jurisdictions that fail to cooperate, including tax havens, and take action to defend our financial system. We will reestablish the Financial Stability Forum with a stronger mandate, and we will reform and expand the IMF and World Bank so they are more efficient, effective, and representative. Finally, we are protecting those who don't always have a voice at the G20, but who have suffered greatly in this crisis. And the United States is ready to lead in this endeavor. In the coming days, I intend to work with Congress to provide $448 million in immediate assistance to vulnerable populations from Africa to Latin America, and to double support for food safety to over $1 billion so that we are giving people the tools they need to lift themselves out of poverty. We will also support the United Nations and World Bank as they coordinate the rapid assistance necessary to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. I have to say, though, that this is not just charity. These are all future markets for all countries and future drivers of world economic growth. And let me also underscore my appreciation to Prime Minister Brown, his entire team, and all my colleagues from around the world who contributed to the summit's success. You know, it's hard for 20 heads of state to bridge their differences. We've all got our own national policies. We all have our own assumptions, our own political cultures, but our citizens are all hurting. They all need us to come together. So I'm pleased that the G20 has agreed to meet again this fall, because I believe that this is just the beginning. Our problems are not going to be solved in one meeting. They're not going to be solved in two meetings. We're going to have to be proactive in shaping events and persistent in monitoring our progress to determine whether further action is needed. I also want to just make a few remarks about additional meetings I had outside of the G20 context. While here in London, I had the opportunity to hold bilateral meetings with leaders of Russia, China, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and India, as well as Great Britain. And these discussions were extraordinarily valuable and productive. Of course, we spoke about additional steps to promote economic recovery and growth, but we also discussed coordinated actions on a range of issues, how we could reduce the nuclear threat, how we could forge a coordinated response to North Korea's planned missile launch, how we can turn back terrorism and stabilize Afghanistan, how we can protect our planet from the scourge of climate change. I'm encouraged that we laid the groundwork for real and lasting progress on a host of these issues. Ultimately, the challenges of the 21st century can't be met without collective action. Agreement will almost never be easy, and results won't always come quickly. But I am committed to respecting different points of view and to forging a consensus instead of dictating our terms. That's how we made progress in the last few days, and that's how we will advance and uphold our ideals in the months and years to come. You know, at home, I've often spoken about a new era of responsibility. And I believe that this era must not end at our borders. In a world that's more and more interconnected, we all have responsibilities to work together to solve common challenges. And although it will take time, I am confident that we will rebuild global prosperity if we act with a common sense of purpose, persistence, and the optimism that the moment demands. So I appreciate your attention, and I'm going to take a few questions. Now, I've got a list of a few people I'm going to call on, and then I will intersperse some folks I'm calling on randomly. Helene Cooper. There you go. Well, I think we did okay. You know, when I came here, it was with the intention of listening and learning, but also providing American leadership. And I think that the document that has been produced, as well as the concrete actions that will follow, reflect a range of our priorities. We wanted to make sure that we had a strong, coordinated response to growth, and that's reflected in the document and the actions that will be taken. We thought it was important to make sure that we had a strong, coordinated regulatory response. And many of the details of the regulatory response draw from principles that we had developed prior to coming here. We felt that it was very important to strengthen our international financial institutions because developing countries, emerging markets are threatened, even though they may not have been the cause of this crisis. They are threatened by capital flight. They're threatened by reduced trade finance, drops in consumer demand in developed countries that were their export markets, and so we knew that it was going to be important to provide those countries with assistance, and we have created as fundamental a reworking of the resources available to these international financial institutions as anything we've done in the last several decades. So overall, I'm pleased with the product, and I'll leave it to others to determine whether me and my team had anything to do with that. All right. Chuck Todd. Chuck.
What concrete items that you got out of this G20 can you tell the American people back home who are hurting, the family struggling, seeing their retirement go down or worrying about losing their job? What happened here today that helps that family back home in the heartland?
Well, as I said before, we've got a global economy. And if we're taking actions in isolation in the United States, but those actions are contradicted overseas, then we're only going to be halfway effective, maybe not even half. You've seen, for example, a drastic decline in U.S. exports over the last several months. You look at a company like Caterpillar in my home state of Illinois, which up until last year was doing extraordinarily well. In fact, export growth was what had sustained it even after the recession had begun. As a consequence of the world recession, as a consequence of the contagion from the financial markets debilitating economies elsewhere, Caterpillar is now in very bad shape. So if we want to get Caterpillar back on its feet, if we want to get all those export companies back on their feet so that they are hiring, putting people back to work, putting money in people's pockets, we've got to make sure that the global economy as a whole is successful. And this document, which affirms the need for all countries to take fiscal responses that increase demand, that encourages the openness of markets, those are all going to be helpful in us being able to fix what ails the economy back home. All right. Let me mix in a Justin Webb, BBC. Where's Justin? There he is. Go ahead.
President, in the spirit of openness, with which you say you're going to run your administration.
Why don't you get a microphone? So, see, everybody's complaining. Yeah. I'm sure that's all your fellow British journalists.
They're extraordinarily well behaved, Mr. President. In the spirit of openness with which you say you're going to run your administration, could you give us an insight into an area or areas where you came to London wanting something and didn't get it, where you compromised, where you gave something away to achieve the wider breakthrough agreement?
Well, I think that if you look at the language of the document, there are probably some areas where it wasn't so much of a sacrifice as it might not have been our number one priority, but it became clear that it was very important to certain other actors. I'd rather not specify what those precise items would be, because this is a collective document. But there's no doubt that each country has its own quirks and own particular issues that a leader may decide is really, really important, something that is non-negotiable for them. And what we tried to do as much as possible was to accommodate those issues in a way that did not hamper the effectiveness of the overall document to address what I think are the core issues related to this crisis. Now, keep in mind, I think that this kind of coordination really is historic. I said in the meeting that if you had imagined 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago that you'd have the leaders of Germany, France, China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, a president of the United States named Obama, former adversaries, in some cases former mortal enemies, negotiating this swiftly on behalf of fixing the global economy, you would have said, that's crazy. And yet it was happening, and it happened with relatively few hiccups. And I think that's a testimony to the great work that Gordon Brown did and his team in organizing the summit, the collective work of our teams in doing some good preparation, some good groundwork. So I'm very proud of what's been done. This alone is not enough. And obviously the actions that each of us take in our individual countries are still absolutely vital. So we have a set of principles, for example, around dealing with systemic risk that I think will be very important in preventing the kinds of financial crisis that we've seen. That does not entirely solve the problem of toxic assets that are still in U.S. banks and certain British banks and certain European banks, and how each individual nation acts to deal with that is still going to be vitally important. How well we execute the respective stimulus programs around the world is going to be very important. The quicker they are, the more effective they are at actually boosting demand, the more all of us will benefit. The more encumbered they are by bureaucracy and mismanagement and corruption, that will hamper our development efforts as a whole. So this is not a panacea, but it is a critical step, and I think it lays the foundation so that should the actions that we've taken individually and collectively so far not succeed in boosting global demand and growth, should you continue to see a freezing of credit or a hemorrhaging of jobs around the world, I think we've created a good foundation for this leadership to come back together again and take additional steps until we get it right. Okay, Michael Scheer. Where's Michael? There we go.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wonder if you view this trip that you're on and the actions that you've taken here at the G20 and with the bilateral meetings that you've had as representing a break from the foreign policy of your predecessor. And if so, could you describe where you see and how you see the principles that guide a different view of the world?
Well, I didn't accompany President Bush on his various summits, so I don't know how he was operating, and I won't, I won't warrant a guess on that. I can tell you that what I've tried to do since I started running for president and since I was sworn in as president, is to communicate the notion that America is a critical actor and leader on the world stage, and that we shouldn't be embarrassed about that, but that we exercise our leadership best when we are listening, when we recognize that the world is a complicated place and that we are going to have to act in partnership with other countries, when we lead by example, when we show some element of humility and recognize that we may not always have the best answer, but we can always encourage the best answer and support the best answer. So I think that's the approach that we've tried to take in our foreign policy since my administration came in. Now, we come in at extraordinarily challenging times, and yet I actually think that that calls for this type of leadership even more. But ultimately, we won't know how effective we are until we look back a year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now and see if it worked. And what the American people care about, I suspect, are the same thing that the British people care about, and that is, are you putting people back to work? Are businesses growing again? Is business is credit flowing again? And that's just true with respect to this summit. When it comes to our Afghanistan policy, the question is going to be: have we made ourselves safer? Have we reduced the risks and incidents of terrorism? And so, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. But hopefully, I think at least we've set a tone internationally where people don't where they give us the benefit of the doubt. They're still going to have their interests, and we're going to have ours. They're going to be tough negotiations, and sometimes we're going to have to walk away from those negotiations if we can't arrive at a common accord. There are going to be real dangers that can't always be talked through and have to be addressed. But at least we can start with the notion that we're prepared to listen and to work cooperatively with countries around the world. All right. Let me sprinkle in another. It's got to be an international person. All right. This young lady right there.
Mr. President, Emma Alberici from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. At the moment, in the US, the UK and in Australia, executive salaries and bonuses are decided in the boardrooms of major publicly listed companies. Who will be making those decisions on salaries and bonuses as a result of the agreement you've made here today? And if it is still the boards, will they be guided by principles or legislation?
The principles that we outlined, I think, put in place or move us in the direction of what I consider to be best practices, which is that there is some accountability with respect to executive compensation. Now, theoretically, that should be the shareholders, but the way that too many corporations have operated for too long is that you have a CEO who basically selects his board. The board, in a fairly cozy relationship, oftentimes with the executive, hires a executive compensation firm which surprisingly tends to think that it's necessary to retain the best talent to pay people $20 or $30 million a year. And we get into the kinds of habits and practices that I think have not served shareholders well. I think ultimately distort the decision-making of many CEOs. When I was in the United States Senate, I actually worked on a piece of legislation that would make the simple proposition that executive compensation should be subject to a shareholder vote, even if it was non-binding, so that there was transparency and accountability, and perhaps a shame function that would take place. That principle, I think, is reflected in these guidelines. What it says is that if you get shareholders involved, and those shareholders are given a set of principles and best practices by which they can judge executive compensation, then you can still have outsized rewards and success for successful business people, but it'll be based on not short-term performance, not three-month performance, not your ability to flip quick profits off products like derivatives that don't turn out to be particularly productive to the company, but based on sustained effective growth. And that's what's embodied in these documents. And I think that you're going to see a lot of countries try to encourage that kind of transparency and accountability. It doesn't mean the state micromanaging. Excuse me. I've been fighting this all week. Doesn't mean that we want the state dictating salaries. We don't. I strongly believe in a free market system, and as I think people understand, in America at least, people don't resent the rich. They want to be rich, and that's good. But we want to make sure that there's mechanisms in place that holds people accountable and produces results. Okay? Got to go back to my crew. Jake Tapper.
Thank you, Mr. President. Two questions. One, can you say with confidence that the steps the G20 nations are taking today, committing to today, will help the world or will prevent the world to avoid a depression or a deeper recession? And two, your friend and ally, Prime Minister Brown, said that the old Washington consensus is over. Today we have reached a new consensus. Is he right? And what do you think he meant by that?
In life, there are no guarantees. In economics, there are no guarantees. The people who thought they could provide guarantees, many of them worked at AIG, and it didn't work out so well. So there are always risks involved. I have no doubt, though, that the steps that have been taken are critical to preventing us sliding into a depression. They are bolder and more rapid than any international response that we've seen to a financial crisis in memory. And I think that they will have a concrete effect in our ability individually in each nation to create jobs, save jobs that exist, grow the economy, loosen up credit, restore trust and confidence in the financial markets. So these steps, another way of putting it is, I think the steps in the communique were necessary. Whether they're sufficient, we've got to wait and see. I'm actually confident, though, that given the common commitment in the United States and in the other G20 countries to act rapidly and boldly, that if we see other inklings of panic in the marketplace or things unwinding, that this group once again will respond as needed. So I guess maybe just to use an analogy that was used several times in